Tonight's event is about 20 years since September the 11th, 2001. Many of you may not even have been born yet, kind of wild to think about sometimes. And the 20th commemoration of 9/11 is this Saturday. So we are here tonight with multiple members of the political science department and an event looking back over the last 20 years. To get your cultural event credit, okay, you must leave your Zoom camera on and you must stay for the entire event from beginning to end. You must keep your eyes on the screen and be engaged the entire time. Please keep yourselves muted, and with that, put things in the chat function. Any questions that you have, comments, feedback, things that you want covered, things that you want clarifications on, anything like that, please don't hesitate, but make sure that that is in the chat function. All right. So our panelists for tonight, we have two great friends and scholars. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Lee Disney. She is the chair and a professor of political science, as well as the director of the Women's Studies program here at Winthrop. She holds a PhD that she earned from CUNY University in New York City with a specialization looking at global feminisms and comparative politics. If you have questions specifically for Dr. Disney, feel free to put those in the chat, or if you would like to speak to her later, you can email her at disneyj@winthrop.edu. Aaron, I see your hand up. You're gonna have to put it in the chat. I'm sorry. And then our other co-panelist is Chris Van Aller, also known as Dr. CVA, fantastic professor emeritus. He did officially retire, but we have brought him out of retirement for us here tonight. And he is a specialist in international relations, earning his PhD from UVA, the University of Virginia, and looking specifically in his scholarship at US foreign policy and civil military relations. You can email Dr. Van Aller at vanallerc@winthrop.edu. And then I'm Dr. Brandon Ronaldo Benavidez. I forgot to put one for me on here. I'm also known as Dr. BRB. I'm also in the political science department. I also teach in the women's studies program. I am a public administration and public policy specialist. I'm relatively new here at Winthrop. This is the beginning of my third year, and you can email me at benavidezb@winthrop.edu if you have questions for me. All righty. I want to preface before we get into some of the content for this event that this may be both a discussion and images that are difficult. So we are going to be talking about 9/11, the terrorist attacks in New York City, Washington, and Pennsylvania, as well as talking about the military and civilian effects on all the different sides of these conflicts over time. Because of that, please take into consideration how to be respectful of all of the situations that we're discussing, as well as your own mental health requirements. I have taken some efforts to make sure there's nothing particularly graphic that's going to be shown, but there will be images of the damage done, the life lost, the effect on culture and the economy of all the different countries and peoples involved. So with that being said, I'm going to get us started with our first question. The way that this is going to work is I'm going to offer a broad question that either Dr. Van Aller or Dr. Disney will begin to discuss. The other will chime in and give their feedback as they're discussing. As kind of background visual aids, I will slowly go through some images, but please make sure you're staying focused on the actual information being given by our two experts. So the first question that I have is for either panelist. Could you just give us a brief description of the immediate preceding 9/11, the event itself, and the immediate aftermath?
Um, Dr. Jen, you want me to go first?
Sure, CDA, why don't you get us started?
My grandmother might be upset, but at any rate, I just want to welcome everyone. And I do want to say one thing, that I'm glad you're getting cultural events credit for this, but just think about the fact that this is incredibly important stuff. You may have had friends and relatives and loved ones that had to be involved in these situations. And, but for the grace of God, there go you. So I hope that helps you keep your focus on what for some of you, of course, is brand new material in a way. So think about that. Well, what I can briefly say is that 9/11 was, a real bolt from the blue. It was totally sudden. I can still remember we were in our HMXP class. Some of you are in HMXP, and we all wandered out of class in total disbelief, joining the rest of the country in that sense. But it's hard to imagine the emotional kind of shock to everybody having such a huge thing on our TV screens. And basically, it was repeatedly upon them. It basically caused sort of a spasm in the country of fear. Fear, for example, of shutting down all air traffic instantly. A lot of people were trapped overseas. There was all sorts of, there was some unfortunate things too, like being deeply suspicious of anyone who looked Islamic. So it was a very upsetting thing. And one of the things that we talked about in my security class is this scholar named Barbara Enright, who talks about the fact that we're tribalistic. And when we get attacked, we have a visceral reaction against the enemy, which makes it very hard to sort of control ourselves. And terrorism basically works on that sort of idea, to disrupt the enemy emotionally, which it certainly did. It was the first attack on the US since 1812, major attack. So it was completely unprecedented. The media, of course, and now sometimes the media is known as the handmaiden of terrorism, because the media makes these events incredibly visual, and visual mediums are the ones that get people so upset. So we for about 3 or 4 days, there was nothing on TV except for pictures of the towers falling down, and it was incredible. I must admit, we were talking about how this affected each of us personally. My brother-in-law literally was right across the street from the World Trade Center, and he had to walk up 25 blocks to get out of the area and then get over to New Jersey, like on a side road. But it literally took him 14 hours to get home. So now it is important to understand, to me anyway, that this was a completely new sort of terrorist attack. I grew up during the classic age of terrorism in the 1970s. I lived in Europe. There were terrorist incidents in London when I lived there. I actually heard bombs going off. But in all those terrorist incidents, they were very small, essentially upsetting, but very small. I was up in the Eiffel Tower and they blew up a department store, and I saw the smoke from this burning building from the Eiffel Tower, but it was a very small attack. But this was a new kind of attack. Some people say terrorism kind of shifted to sort of a Manichaean approach, which means changing the entire world. And that was unprecedented in terror. And no one expected, for example, a hijacking to produce any kind of mayhem like this, because we'd had hijackings all the time in the 1970s, and nothing like this had ever happened. And just, I think it's also important to understand that, this was a real seismic shift in security policy, because we had just celebrated 10 years of winning the Cold War. We thought we were on our way to, a happy new world. And all of a sudden, boom, this terrible thing happened. Even though our experts actually knew that such an attack was possible. And the 9/11 Commission pointed out all the mistakes that were made in terms of coordination and understanding. And there was no objective reason why we shouldn't have known something this bad could not happen. And we should have planned much, much better. But I do want to say that, I just want to dig deep into, to some extent, our culture, because America in many ways is an isolationist culture. We don't think about the world. We don't understand the world. We only get involved in it in an episodic sort of way. And then when we do, we often lash out in an unthinking way. And I think that often explains some of our reactions to terrorism. And I'll just say the very last thing is that I think the administration in this first few days, first week or so after the attack, felt unbelievable pressure to do something, no matter what, in reaction against such a terrible thing. But the problem with just doing something without deep reflection is in some ways the wrong thing when you're talking about terrorism, because terrorism is about symbolic warfare, and you have to do things in a very careful way. So, thanks.
Thank you, CVA. I want to add to what Dr. Van Aller has said by just giving some basics, facts and stats, and then sharing maybe some emotional context of my location, because I was in New York City on 9/11/2001. But first, let's just do some stats and facts. On September 11th, 2001, 19 men, 15 from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, 1 from Lebanon, all committed to working with Al-Qaeda under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, hijacked 4 commercial airlines that were going from the East Coast to the West Coast. So they were fueled for cross-country flights. 4 planes were hijacked to carry out this terrorist attack on the United States. Slightly before 9 a.m., the first plane went into the first tower. And when people saw that, they assumed it was a pilot error, a pilot mistake, a pilot had a heart attack. It was only when the second plane hit into the second tower, that was when we knew this was a terrorist attack. And that scene, BRB, go back to that scene with the gentleman walking in with President George W. Bush was reading to a kindergarten class. And this gentleman came in his ear and said, the second tower was hit, America's under attack. And I want to recommend, I'll put some hyperlinks in the chat. I want to recommend, and Dr. Chris Van Aller turned me on to this, Turning Point, 9/11 and the War on Terror is a Netflix series, 5-hour-long episodes. It's a great way to kind of reinforce what you're learning from us tonight and to see some of the images and hear some of the interviews of people who were directly involved in governmental decision making. So please watch that. I'm glad to see that some of you have. And if you haven't, put that on your Netflix agenda, Turning Point. It's outstanding to hear the interviews of people that were there live. So imagine your president, George W. Bush, you're reading to a kindergarten class, someone tells you in your ear, the second tower, a second plane has hit the second tower, America's under attack. I will put the link in the chat. It's called Turning Point, 9/11 and the War on Terror. But if you just search Turning Point in Netflix, you'll find it. So I want to just take a minute and sit with the facts of the day. 2 planes went into the Twin Towers, these symbols of capitalism of the West, of the United States of America, burning. A plane went into the Pentagon. I think BRB has some of those pictures. And a 4th plane we think was aiming for the US Capitol. But the members of the plane heard what had happened. There is direct recordings of them talking to their families saying, I don't think I'm making it home. I think our plane was hijacked too. And those people on that plane that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, took that plane down to prevent another attack. I mean, it is unfathomable to think about that. Think about the courage that it took. You know you will never see your family again. And you are stepping in to prevent the deaths of others, hundreds, maybe thousands. So this, this is a serious thing that we're talking about. I just want us to take a minute and think about the lives lost on that day. There were close to 3,000 lives lost, and that includes the 265 people in the 4 planes, including the terrorists themselves, 2,606 in the World Trade Center and the surrounding area, 125 at the Pentagon, over 400 first responders in New York City. I think we forget about everybody who was touched, all of the loss, all of the families. It's an incredible moment to sit with, and I can't believe it's been 20 years. So I want to applaud Dr. BRB for having this event so we can sit and reflect both personally and politically as political scientists on what this means for our nation. Just to bring the personal to the political, I was a graduate student at CUNY at the time. I was asleep in my 1-room studio in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, when my phone rang. And my mom said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "What are you talking about? I'm asleep." And she said, "A plane just flew into the World Trade Center." And I said, "You're kidding." And I got up and I turned on my TV. And I was talking to my mom. This was about 8:47, I think. 9:06, the second plane hit. I was talking to my mom, watching it, and saw it live on TV, what had happened, the second plane hit. I cannot tell you the devastation of that moment. Just the random act of life and death, that if you happened to work on a floor that was below where the planes hit, you had a chance to get out. You had a chance to walk down 90 flights of steps, because when the alarm sounded, the elevator stopped working. But if you happened to be on the floors above where the planes hit, you had very little chance to get out, to get to safety. I had a colleague and friend at CUNY who actually worked in the World Trade Center. He's one of the lucky ones who was able to walk down, I don't know how many stories of steps and get out that day. So I just wanted to just take a minute and just have a moment to reflect and think about, that's an amazing picture. And I can tell you this, because I lived in Brooklyn, that huge gray cloud of smoke hung over the city for months. I remember the very next day I said, "I've got to go down there, I've got to go." You couldn't get to the subways right around where it happened, but I found a way to get there just to kind of see, because you just didn't believe it. You didn't believe, A, that these buildings were hit, and 2, that the fire and the gasoline, the way that they fell, it just seemed impossible, unfathomable, unimaginable. I remember just wanting to be there to see it, to make it real. I had many other friends or colleagues who said, "I don't want to go anywhere near ground zero." So everybody had a different emotional reaction to that place and space. And I remember that gray cloud, lingering for months. And you think about what that cloud represented, all the lives lost, all of the debris, looking and looking, finding things, trying to track down the number of walls of posters missing, the number of people who couldn't find their mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, daughters, spouses, husbands, wives, that it took a while to identify bodies, and some maybe have never been identified, right? So, this is the worst terrorist attack on US soil, and it's something to reflect upon, all the lives lost, just for a minute, before we break down the politics of what happened before and what happened since, and we put on our hats as political scientists.
I was just going to say one thing, that they were actually hoping to catch everyone in those 2 buildings once, in the words, on a regular, when everybody was in the buildings for their jobs. And for whatever reason, people were not in their building. Everybody was running late. There's something happened to cause everybody not to be pretty much in those 2 buildings. So we might have had 50,000 people killed if everyone had been there. But luckily, far fewer were in there. And the second thing is, they were hoping to collapse the 2 buildings like 2 giant dominoes into the rest of Manhattan, which luckily in that sense didn't happen either. So it's incredible, the more intense you know about it.
Yeah, I just want us all to take a second to really reflect on the amazing, the kind of what Dr. Disney said. It's important as we go through this conversation, we're going to unravel the effect of this and the wars that come after. And as we have those important and needed and necessary conversations about the politics of the wars and the strategies or misstrategies, if you want, depending on your perspective, I think it's important to also locate the beginning of this conversation with understanding, having those conversations and discussing the political fallout or the political effects, to use a less loaded term. We need to find a way to decouple that with allowing the space of saying that the loss of life is always tragic. It's always allowable to have the strong emotional appeals, and no one's invalidating that. Don't matter their type of discussion of whether or not the wars that come afterward unraveled in a laudable or unlaudable way. And so I am glad that both of our panelists have given us this space to think about the political and the personal, okay? The next question I'm gonna ask is about the effect of this. So obviously, we see this, we see President Bush hearing about 9/11, being told the second tower has been hit, learning very quickly that this is a terrorist attack. This is not a fluke, plane lost control and whammed into a really tall tower. This is obviously orchestrated. So can y'all talk us through, y'all being the two panelists here, the immediate after effects, and then distinguishing a little bit for us, and then we'll go in them in more depth, the wars, the strategies that come thereafter. So the immediate after effects, and then I think we can kind of think of it as three wars: a specific war in Afghanistan, a specific war in Iraq, and a more broad term war on terror, which is more about this terrorism idea. All right, thank you.
Okay, I'll jump in first here. And Cassivia, you probably have a lot more detail that you can add to this, but let me start by saying, and BRB, you raised this theme earlier. One of the most noteworthy immediate responses was the bipartisan agreement. We live in a world that's very polarized right now, and so it's hard to imagine bipartisan agreement. But there was immediate bipartisan support that the U.S. was attacked. The U.S. needs to fight back. It was anger, it was revenge, it was punishment, deterrence. It was all those things in one. U.S. citizens, U.S. public officials, the Bush administration all agreed we must do something, we must act. Okay, so I want to recognize that for good and for bad, as CVA and I will try to unravel, there was immediate support from both political parties. One of the immediate aftermaths was the approval of broad war powers. I think it was like 90 words in a paragraph that basically said the administration has the right to respond, to attack any and all the terrorists or anybody aiding and abetting or supporting the terrorists, period, end of story. In both houses of Congress, there was one person who voted no, and that was Representative Barbara Lee from California. Unanimous support in the Senate, unanimous support in the House -1. So think about that for a minute. Unanimous support for these broad war powers in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to empower George W. Bush as Commander-in-Chief, President George W. Bush, to fight back. It was stunning for me to remind myself of that. And what we'll talk about is that those broad war powers, no specifics on who we were going to attack, when, where, how, right? So here we are 20 years later with what many call the debacle of the leaving of Afghanistan. And we all have to trace and wonder tonight, it started and ended with Afghanistan, with an Iraq war and a global war on terror in between. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, what was good and what was bad about what took place over the last 20 years. Okay. So I'll try to highlight some of those moments to try to, as BRB said, to disentangle these different wars. The immediate attack was on Afghanistan because that was understood to be the home of Al-Qaeda. That was understood to be where Osama bin Laden was. That was understood to be the place where Al-Qaeda terrorists were using as a home base, even though none of the hijackers were from Afghanistan, right? That was seen to be as a home base or space or place of Osama bin Laden and the terrorist network that was known as Al-Qaeda. For many, that immediate bombing of Afghanistan was justified and it was successful. We can talk a lot about just and unjust wars, but I'll try to make some differences. There was immediate support, there was broad-based US support for the immediate attack on Afghanistan. The Taliban seemed to be blown away. The message seemed to be given clearly that this was not going to be accepted. You could not attack the USA and get away with it. After that, many people felt that there had to be a little bit of a longer stay in Afghanistan to try to prevent this from happening again. However, the Bush administration turned its attention toward Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the Bush administration began talking about Saddam Hussein as a harborer of terrorists, Saddam Hussein as a supporter of Al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein as having WMDs, and wanting to get rid of Saddam Hussein because of regime change. So for many Americans, the reason we were attacking Afghanistan made sense. The reason we started attacking Iraq, the reasons kept changing, right? And so for many Americans, that made the Iraq war a less just war. And I just want to read to you, there was a 9/11 commission that was created while this was happening to look into the events of 9/11. There's a PDF, I'll put the link in the chat in a few minutes. You could read, it's a 564-page report. And I just want to read one conclusion. In 2004, the 9/11 commission said there was no evidence of an operational relationship between the Saddam Hussein regime and Al-Qaeda. No stockpiles or WMDs or an active WMD program was ever found in Iraq. Bush administration officials made numerous claims about the purported Saddam Al-Qaeda relationship and WMDs that many argued at the time was based on sketchy evidence. Intelligence officials rejected after Colin Powell made this impassioned speech in front of the United Nations talking about the WMDs in Iraq. And then you had to see eventually President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Colin Powell all admit that there were not WMDs in Iraq and that there was no relationship, although some, I guess, could still debate this, and I'm curious your thoughts, CVA, between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So again, just to be clear, Afghanistan, the location of Osama bin Laden, the networks that the Taliban had been creating, the terrorist networks that came into and became known as Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan, immediate aftermath, bombing. A little bit later, Iraq. Saddam Hussein's a bad man. He harbors terrorists too. We want to get rid of him. He hurts the Kurds. We want regime change. Many people argue it was that Iraq war that was fought on false reasons, false premises, actually diverted attention from the good work that was being done in Afghanistan initially, in terms of not only getting rid of the Taliban, but maybe engaging in some aspects of nation building. Then we'll talk about the pros and cons of nation building and the extent to which you can actually impose your values into another country militarily. But I think it's really important for you to think about first Afghanistan, second Iraq, and the global war on terror was kind of, it's been part of the story for using those broad powers in a variety of ways over the last 20 years, including President Obama engaging in a surge again in Afghanistan and using drone strikes that were heavily criticized because those drone strikes actually caused many, many, many more civilian casualties. And so it's difficult to nation build and to be, for the American military to try to work with Afghan military and Afghan civilians to try to earn trust. And then suddenly Afghan civilians are becoming collateral damage in drone strikes. You're losing friends, the friends you just fought to build, right? This is that famous scene, and then I'll let CVA jump in. This is an iconic moment in the Situation Room under the Obama administration when they found intelligence on the location of Osama bin Laden. And they had I believe it was a Navy SEALs raid. I think it was a SEAL team. And they said they had a 50-50 shot that the man inside was Osama bin Laden. And if you watch this Turning Point series, they show you through methodically exactly how it happened. The helicopter crashed on the roof, so they had to figure out a way to get rid of the helicopter. They had other helicopters thereby to get out. And Osama bin Laden was killed in that raid. So they came home with the equipment, they came home with the body, and that allowed for Obama to have his shining moment, which was kind of like George W. Bush's shining moment. In the immediate aftermath of bombing Afghanistan, it made Americans feel good that we were responding. Obama had his shining moment. We got Osama bin Laden. And there were people in Washington, D.C. and across the country cheering and with waving American flags. And there was this moment of, we did it. We got the man who orchestrated the attacks on 9/11.
Okay. All right. I have thought about this stuff so much for 20 years. My head's about to explode to all the things I could say. And I don't want you guys to be overwhelmed, but I thought I'd just give you first a couple of themes we should think about. Someone has said fighting unconventional war, including terrorism, is like eating soup with a knife. Eating soup with a knife, which essentially means balance is everything. If you do too much, that's bad. If you do too little, that's bad. So that's one idea to think about. The second thing is that some people have thought of terror as more like cancer than as a war. And if you, for example, are too harsh on the patient who has cancer, you kill the patient. So in other words, if we think of terrorism like cancer, we have to be very adroit and thoughtful about how we fight it. And the last sort of theme I would talk about is a famous phrase from Sun Tzu, a famous military tactician who said, if you know yourself as well as the enemy, you need not fear 100 battles. And the reason this is important is that, do we understand ourselves as a country in terms of dealing with something as complex as terrorism? It's an extremely complex issue. And I would argue if I had to choose a country that was to some extent ill-suited to dealing with terrorists, it is the United States. We have a very curious political culture that makes it hard for us to deal with a phenomenon like terrorism. So anyway, essentially, it's important to understand that we fought really 3 wars, as Dr. Jennifer said. The one generally worldwide on terror, the one in Afghanistan, and the one in Iraq. And I would argue that our so-called strategic culture made it hard for us to do perhaps what would have been objectively the best thing to do. So for example, in terms of our strategic culture, we're not very good as a military or as a country on fighting limited wars. It's just something we don't do too well, as we saw, say, for example, in Vietnam. We're not a very patient country. We do not want to stay fixated on, particularly on a foreign policy thing for very long. And then probably most profoundly, we often do not understand foreign cultures and foreign approaches to things well at all. So, and also in terms of our military is designed for major conflicts, but security today is really like a chameleon. Many things our traditional military is not very useful for. So I would just go into the three parts a little bit. In terms of the general war on terror, we did stop further major attacks and even minor attacks on the homeland since 9/11. We did indeed do that. For example, there was a big one. They were going to let some bombs off in the New York City subway, the way they did actually in London in 2015. But that we got them. That stopped, and I think we did stop a number of at least initial planning for attacks, and so we never really had a big attack. We never had a big attack at all in the United States. Again, actually, the Europeans got hit a lot harder than we did. But of course, and then we caught Bin Laden, which is of course a wonderful thing. But if you talk to the terrorism experts, they point out that terrorism was a much broader issue than just Bin Laden. It was an upswelling of resentment against the West, of unemployed youth in the Islamic world, and a whole bunch of things. And by the time in other words, by just getting the quarterback, we didn't stop the game. And so even though we're obviously glad that Bin Laden was brought to justice. But the other thing is, in terms of eating soup with a knife, we didn't balance things sometimes very well at all. So, for example, we did something called waterboarding, which is basically torture. We did drone strikes, which killed a lot of people in that area of the world. And we also at home did the Patriot Act, which interfered with people's civil liberties. And of course, we had the infamous prison at Guantanamo. Now, some of you may say, well, you just got to kick some, what, when you're fighting terrorism, and, whatever works is whatever works. But we know from terrorism studies that the more extreme a country is fighting terrorism, the more it satisfies the thesis of the terrorist. In other words, we confirm the thesis of the terrorist if we do bad stuff. So literally being moral is in the national interest when you're fighting terrorists. And you may think, hey, we should torture this guy until he coughs up some information, but often torture doesn't work at all, which the FBI has frequently pointed out. But also, when the word gets out, as it eventually does, the terrorists are able to recruit more people. The more over the top things that we do, and so it's not just immoral; it's unwise. But we certainly did stop the things at home. However, it is important to understand also that the larger war on terrorism isn't over. As Dr. Jennifer's point about that series indicates, there's a lot more terrorist groups now than there were in 9/11. They've kind of morphed into a lot of groups, and terrorism is going on all over the place in the Middle East and in Africa. It's just that the US media, they want to pay attention to a building blowing up in New York, but they don't want to pay attention to the vagaries of, say, terrorism in Nigeria or Kenya. So that's something to think about too. But it's safe to say that, is terrorism going to continue forever and ever? I think it's safe to say that terrorist acts against us in the first world have diminished greatly. Most experts think that terrorism has kind of had its day in the first world, other than, of course, right-wing terrorism, which is something we forget about now too. But aside from that, what we have in the West now is what are called self-recruited terrorists. Someone just basically reads stuff online and go build something, but even they are fairly ineffective. Now, in terms of Afghanistan, we went in there to get Bin Laden, and of course we failed because of some crucial tactical mistakes that we made in the Tora Bora Mountains, which was a sad thing because we should have done it better. But at that point, we had broken the back of Al Qaeda itself. And I would say Senator Biden at that point, as well as Donald Rumsfeld, two odd couples, they said it's time to leave. In other words, we've pretty much broken Al Qaeda. Let's just leave Afghanistan. But that didn't happen because the mission turned into kind of a nation building affair where the idea was that if we stop Afghanistan being a haven to terrorists and make them into a democracy, then we won't have to worry. The problem is that, of course, this is almost impossible to do. Nation building has failed statistically like 9 times out of 10 every time it's been tried. In other words, you can't go into an undeveloped country with traditions and give them your traditions. Just because you give them beautiful uniforms, just those women in the Afghan army had those wonderful uniforms, and you train them in American ways, doesn't mean it's going to work. As a matter of fact, I would argue making the Afghan army work like ours was one of the biggest mistakes we made. We should have designed an army that reflected their traditions, not ours. But of course, as Dr. Jennifer pointed out, it's also true that the stupidest thing we did was to go fight the war in Iraq when we were already involved in Afghanistan. And even if Saddam Hussein had supported Al Qaeda, which he did not, there's just so much you can do at one time. So I can't even tell you, all the soldiers in Afghanistan were going, what the you know what? How can we do our mission if you're taking all our support away to Iraq? And so, the only alternative was to, mobilize the draft, garrison Afghanistan and Iraq for the next 50 years, which is what John McCain wanted to do. Basically admit that we're quasi-imperialist and just stay there like the British did a century earlier. So it's pretty sad that Afghanistan today is revealing that the whole thing was kind of built on a house of cards. And I think it's, for all President Biden's faults on a precipitous withdrawal, he was always against this larger 20-year mission in Afghanistan. Now, in terms of Iraq, this was the biggest mistake of all because we broke up an existing nation in the Middle East, and we actually spread terror in the name of ISIS and the remnants of Al Qaeda. So we metastasized terror when we broke up Iraq, and that was a real problem. We also destroyed the Middle East balance of power because Iran then and still has become commensurately more powerful. A very famous U.S. general, U.S. general in charge of the Middle East, said we could have just contained Saddam the way we had with the USSR. We did not have to attack him at that point. It was really stupid because he didn't have nuclear weapons and he also didn't have any connections to Al Qaeda, although he did support some other terrorists, that's true. But there's just so much, almost all foreign policy scholars would say that the Iraq War was perhaps the stupidest strategic mistake we made in the last 20 years and, was just a horrible mistake. And a civil war endures still in Iraq between the Shia and Sunnis, with the now Shia in charge, with the unfortunate Kurds being, as usual, the victims of this policy because they were sort of left out to dry as well. So there, I've said that, at some point we might have had to go in to Iraq, but that was certainly not the time to do so. And none of our allies, except the United Kingdom, was willing to help us. When I was in Poland on my Fulbright during this period, the Poles had an expression that their troops in Iraq were the coalition of the bought because they felt that's why their troops were there. Now, that's all I got to say about those three things. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to remind everyone, please make sure we are paying attention let's make sure we're paying attention way more to what the scholars are telling us instead of getting in a tit for tat in the chat function. But I like that y'all are engaged. Now, Dr. Disney is going to give us some more insight, and reflection before we move on to the last question, or the second to last question, excuse me.
So I just want to comment a little bit, add to what CVA has said, and I'm reading what people are saying in the chat. So I want to just address a few themes. One of the themes may be a question, Dr. BRB, that you're going to ask us. And, it has to do with, in a sense, how do we fight terrorism and still take account for human rights and humanitarian interests, humanitarian causes, the values that the United States Constitution was built upon. And that's been a struggle for many people in the military and in the US government, is how do we stay true to our constitutional principles while keeping America safe and while fighting terrorism? And so I don't claim to have an easy answer for that. I do want to talk through some of the dilemmas in that we have experienced over the last 20 years. And I want to start with members of the military. Many of you who are in the conversation right now may have served in the US military. One of the things that's the most disturbing to me, who I have never fought in the US military, it angers and pains me to imagine that we are setting out our troops into a situation where they are not prepared to be safe. They do not have the right resources they need to be safe. They don't know what it means to win in the context of what they're doing. They don't have a clear mission. The number of members of the US military in Afghanistan who I heard state, and this had a lot to do with during the surge under President Obama, that they did not know what they were doing there. There was no clear mission. And this was being said by military leaders, not just soldiers on the ground. That is unconscionable. And we know that when soldiers come home and the United States government doesn't give them what they need at home after being in war, in terms of housing and healthcare and mental health care and PTSD, it is angering. People are giving their lives, as this image shows, to keep America safe, to protect us, the civilians. And yet we're sending them off to war for false reasons, George W. Bush, or we are sending them off to war without a clear mission, President Obama. So there's plenty of bipartisan blame and responsibility to go around across all the presidents of the last 20 years who have touched this issue. I want to be real clear about that. It's also true that this terrorism versus human rights is not always either or struggle, because as Dr. CVA mentioned, when you engage in human rights abuses abroad and you claim to be the beacon of light across the world, guess what that does? It breeds terrorism. It fosters jihad. It fosters people that say, what was the difference between the Russian occupation of Afghanistan and the American occupation of Afghanistan? And then you say, what is the difference? Wow, maybe we need to talk about that. In other words, if you go back 79 to 89 was when the Soviet Union had an occupation or an invasion of Afghanistan. What was happening in the US at the time? And with the Soviet Union, the Cold War, right? So now that old foreign policy adage, the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So who did the United States side with against the Soviet Union? The Taliban, the Mujahideen, any insurgents in Afghanistan that were fighting the Soviet Union. We helped arm, we helped train, we gave the kind of guns and money that come back to hurt us in the wars with Afghanistan for the last 20 years. So that's the sad reality of foreign policy, is that we have participated in arming the very same people who we then deposed from government, who then under President Trump, we decided to meet with and negotiate with the Taliban and decide to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners who are now back in charge in Afghanistan. A country and a people group, a leadership of the Taliban who don't want women and girls to be educated. You know, many of you have read the story of Malala, who was shot for speaking out, a young girl speaking out for girls' education. Hillary Clinton did so much work as Secretary of State before and after, trying to help bring to light the issues with women and girls. The Taliban is saying, oh, let's throw more acid in the faces of women and girls when they're not fully wearing the the imposed, what these women are wearing is like the hijab to cover the hair. The burqa was imposed by the Taliban regime, was a particular piece of clothing that covered the entire body, and that's just a slit to see. That was a political decision from the Taliban. So my point is, it's been a long and winding road with US support for, against, and now for again, in terms of, if you look at the withdrawal that Trump negotiated, the withdrawal of President Trump, the release of prisoners with the Taliban that Biden then inherited, and then the withdrawal that he moved from May to August that he and his team did not handle well. But it's hard to think when would be enough, right? 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. When would there have been a good time to leave Afghanistan? When would there have been a good time? Would we have ever been able to be successful to nation build? And I guess I'll close with these two thoughts and go back to your final questions, BRB. I don't want to say it was all a waste. I am not going to sit here and say that trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives were all a waste. I can speak specifically for the women and girls for the last 20 years who have been able to exercise more freedom, get access to an education, the healthcare, the advances in healthcare. There has been a good bit of infrastructure that was brought to Afghanistan and political cultural change to help people see what is possible. The women and men of Afghanistan, the Afghani people, are going to have to fight back to maintain that against the Taliban. And that's what we all fear. We fear what can happen to vulnerable populations. At the same time, we have to think about vulnerable populations in the United States and the US's commitment to human rights at home and abroad. And so when we participate in that image from Abu Ghraib, which is an Iraqi prison, that's in Iraq, Abu Ghraib. When we participate in Guantanamo Bay, where we call people detainees instead of prisoners, so that we can avoid the Geneva Convention, so that we can engage in torture and not have to worry about them having to have any type of international law claims. These are things that we do that hurt us globally because it simply breeds terrorism, and it hurts the claims the US has when the US tries to do well, right? When the US tries to share democracy and nation building abroad. So we have to, it is not easy. It is not easy, but we have to constantly think about the relationship between fighting terrorism and being true to our humanitarian and human rights commitment as a nation, or we will simply continue to breed terrorism at home and abroad.
All right, so I have seen this question multiple times, so I'm gonna address it real quick. What I was trying to do, sometimes, you know, this is organic, the conversation is moving in a way, so I have to switch between photos very quickly. I'm trying to juxtapose, we hear these human rights arguments for, well, the United States was building a society where women had opportunities and could do things like join the military or join the government. And that is good, and it is true, and it did happen, and it was worthwhile. At the same time, the human rights argument cuts the other direction. And this isn't, these are American military personnel in Abu Ghraib, which is a prison in Iraq that, what is a long loaded way to say it? They uncontroversially definitely transgressed the human rights of the prisoners held at that prison. I don't know, but if you want to learn more about it, basically this is a prison in Iraq where American service members were given directives to brutalize, I guess, not to use the term torture, I will say brutalized some of the inmates, dehumanized, other types of words. If you would like to learn more about it, there's many things, there you go, there's one in the chat right there, the Abu Ghraib prison atrocity scandal. And so what I wanted to do, and I think Dr. Disney and Dr. Van Aller have been kind of having this conversation in a really complex way, and it's nearly impossible, y'all. How do you defend human rights and abuse them at the same time without coming across as hypocrites? But we don't want to just throw away all the good things that did come out of building schools and allowing women to get educated and be mayors and members of government and members of the military and allowing Kurds and people who are in ethnic and religious minorities in the region to not be oppressed and murdered at will by people like Saddam Hussein, right? And so this is not a broad brush discussion. It is hard. If you think it's easy to know the answer to how to either defend or not defend human rights, I would love to have a conversation with you, because it becomes incredibly difficult and it cuts multiple directions. They have bags on their heads. It's part of the dehumanization that happened. Okay, my final question for our panelists. Thinking fairly across the last 20 years, we've had 20 years of war since the war in Afghanistan, since 9/11, which has given us the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the broader war on terror. We've had 4 presidents in that span from both political parties, alternating Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. How do we fairly assess Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden? And then lastly, if you want to separate it out as a separate question, you can. Was this withdrawal from Afghanistan that has been so horrific always doomed to be a disaster? The Taliban was always going to come back? Or should Biden be particularly held accountable for doing poorly? All right, thank you.
It's hard to encapsulate 20 years in such a way. Anyway, let's just think about the presidents really quick, then talk about the withdrawal. In terms of President Bush, I think he was guilty of reacting in a precipitous fashion in terms of some of the things he did and some of the decisions his administration made, such as approving, for example, waterboarding and things like that. But in terms of something positive Bush understood, I think I really admired him, the way he continually emphasized that the war in Iraq was, all the 3 wars really had nothing to do with Islam. He kept repeating that. And that I thought was a really important thing to say. Now, in terms of President Obama, I think he even understood better than President Bush that terrorism is a phenomenon caused by globalization and some of the historic record of what the United States and the West has done in less developed parts of the world. And he gave a famous speech in Egypt where he basically said, we're sorry for what we did, which made him very, very popular overseas, maybe less popular on Fox News. But I think his main failing was that he knew that the Afghanistan operation was kind of doomed by the time he got in power. And yet the military, with their kind of can-do mentality, which is very powerful in the military, kind of convinced him to pour more troops in while Biden was pulling him the other way to get the hell out. So he sort of temporized with a policy that sort of kept us in, but didn't really get anything major accomplished. So I think that was in some ways his fault. Presidents are often totally unwilling to stop a military operation on their watch because it makes them look weak. And that is a continuing problem in presidential histories, for example. Now, in terms of President Trump, in his inimitable way, he really did say that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were big mistakes. And he kept saying it over and over and over. So, I think he was right. But then he really didn't have the patience for extended negotiations and extended study of how you get out of a morass, which is very difficult, I certainly will admit. So in its negotiations with the Taliban, they didn't include the Afghan government, our allies, which is something that happened during Vietnam too. And he also, he didn't put any conditions on the Taliban, as well as an end date. So those things kind of hemmed President Biden in a lot of ways. Now, in terms of Biden, I think he was always against nation building, always against a long-term manipulation of a foreign culture for your ends, because he just didn't think it would work. So I give him full marks on that. But I think it's also safe to say that a lot of experts think that he could have done better on the withdrawal, that he was too precipitous. But of course, even that, I would like to study up a little bit before I condemn him totally on that, because I would like to know what the Pentagon told him, what plans were in place. I have read reports that the Pentagon really didn't want to leave. They thought Biden was just going to say, well, let's do another couple months and keep kicking the can down the road. And institutionally, the Pentagon wanted to keep doing that. I would also say that historically, very few armies have fallen in 2 weeks. So what that means is there was almost no time to get everybody out. Although if you look at the numbers compared to Vietnam, actually, we got a lot more people out than we did during Vietnam. Although, of course, there'll still be obviously tremendous suffering. But in terms of the macro question at the end there, how do we, does America intervene around the world for human rights? What do we do? And it's sort of part of that is the war against terror. And all I can say is that the United States should never act alone, because when we do, we magnify our faults. We don't have help. So when we had a multilateral operation in the former Yugoslavia under NATO and the United Nations, it was far, far from perfect. But today, the 3 states of the ex-Yugoslavia are still extant and people aren't being massacred. So sometimes it can work if there's a multilateral approach. When we go in by ourselves, militarily, even in Haiti and places like that, it does not work. I was also going to say that the other thing that America seems to lack, which of course would be supported by working with others, is we just don't get foreign cultures. And this book, The Forever War, Dexter Filkins, incredible book, won the Pulitzer Prize. I would suggest you all think about reading it. Talks about that we had no clue how the Afghan society works, no clue. And the fact is that we basically worked through the warlords in Afghanistan to create a democracy. Well, that's a contradiction in terms right there. And Afghanistan came to be known as VICE, which means essentially vertically integrated, basically kleptocracy is really what it meant. Even the US military called Afghanistan a kleptocracy. And the reason that emerged is because we didn't know what we were doing. We made Afghanistan into a clone of the United States, which is impossible to do. The only way this might have succeeded is the most profound understanding of Afghan culture, working through the UN and so forth. But, you know, the realist in me, and some of you know who've had me what realism means, says that it's often more immoral to intervene than not intervene. You may actually cause more problems. So we have to know the limits of our power. It may be very, very, very difficult to change another culture. Some people have said the best you can do is work with what's called civil society, gradually improve things within a country without trying to change its basic culture or political system, which is what we did in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and it worked in neither case.
Wow.
That's all I got.
Okay, I wanted to make sure Dr. Disney had enough time.
Sorry.
No. You gave us a very thorough, you went through all 4 presidents. You talked through, I think, very much pros and cons of each one's approach. And then I would like Dr. Disney, you give us your reflection on the 4 of them and whether or not was Biden, just to be blunt, was Biden's withdrawal a failure, or was it gonna always be doomed to be horrific regardless of when it happened?
And I will be short and sweet in case we have questions in the chat. I know we've had lots of comments. I don't know if we have any questions, but I will hit the highlights of, I think, the good and bad of the last 4 presidents. And I agree a lot with what Dr. Van Aller said. First of all, President Bush, he was strong in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. You know, he said what Americans wanted to hear. We wanted someone to tell us we were going to be okay. We were going to strike back. And there was a certain patriotism and a certain nationalism that he he fostered and he made America come together in that moment. Obviously, the changing reasons to go to war in Iraq, I think, were the biggest blunder of his presidency, not only in and of itself for taking people to war based on false evidence, but because it took us away from what at that point was a winning strategy, at least initially, in Afghanistan. In addition, the broad war powers that were passed in the Bush administration, every president gets the credit and the blame, right, for continuing to utilize those broad war powers. For example, President Obama and the drone strikes. He took a lot of heat for that because of the number of civilian deaths. So while he's talking about the lives he's saving with drone strikes, we're seeing bodies of children, women and civilians, men, women, and children, civilians in Afghanistan because of the drone strikes. It's hard to say we're here to help with that kind of reality. So that was not good for the Obama administration in terms of trying to nation build in the longest, truest sense in Afghanistan. The expansive surveillance powers on US citizens, that's something also every president has really maintained. And if you want to learn more about questions around that, you can look up Edward Snowden and find out about what's happening around surveillance and spying on US citizens and those programs. Bush, strong, talked about, as CVA said, he definitely tried to distinguish between fundamentalist Islam and Muslims. He tried to fight against the Islamophobia that was occurring in the country. And that's important because I think that was one of President Trump's failings, is that he seemed to try to other various groups in our culture and society. I think it was more divisive, whereas President Bush did a better job of distinguishing between terrorists and Muslims, US citizens, and an entire religion, and making sure that religion didn't take the hit for a few, just like fundamentalist Christians who commit acts of violence shouldn't blemish all of Christianity. We talked in one of my classes today about how religion is a tool that can do great good or great evil. Getting to the more contemporary Trump and Biden, I think Trump negotiating with the Taliban without having the very Afghan government that we had propped up was horrific. That was a bad decision. So the Afghan government we've trained, that we helped put into place, they're not a part of the negotiations we have with the Taliban. The release of the 5,000 prisoners, not a fan of that decision. Putting no strings on the Taliban in return, not a fan of that decision. And I don't know what to say about Biden's debacle. It's clearly a blemish on his record. I want to know more, like CVA, because I've heard different stories about who he listened to or who he didn't listen to. And so I want to hear more. I think that's live. It's easy in history and retrospect. It's harder when something's right now. I want to do more research on who told Biden what, who he did and didn't listen to. But it's got to be seen as a blemish on his record. Now, to go to your question, BRB, was this doomed to fail at any time? And I fear that I have to say yes. So as much as I'm unhappy with the way Biden left, and I'm unhappy about the translators who didn't get out, and I'm unhappy with the bodies falling off of planes who are trying to get out because they fear for their lives. It's a horrible human rights. I mean, it's unfathomable that people who've helped us for 20 years, we promised to get them visas. And then because of Trump and Biden, the visa program didn't process, didn't move, didn't do what we need to do to protect our allies on the ground. Horrific. At the same time, as CVA said, who had the courage to leave? Who had the courage to leave? Not Obama. It took Trump and Biden to have the courage to leave, because you can't have perpetual war. You can't occupy somebody forever. At some point, you give a country the tools, you try to help militarily and in a civilian way. And then after that, you've got to see if that country can handle it on its own. And it will remain to be seen what Afghanistan is able to do on its own.
I think the only question that I saw come through the chat was a little bit more of a discussion, if either one of you would like, why did Obama like the drone policy so much?
CVA may know more about this. All I know is I think he could defend, they were trying to get out ground troops so they could defend not putting US soldiers into harm's way because these were unmanned drones, right? So you were not putting US soldiers in harm's way, but you were trying to attack targeted hits in Afghanistan. The problem was the hits weren't so targeted and too many civilians. There was too much quote unquote collateral damage in terms of civilian deaths. And so I think he was trying to save you. He eventually did start removing troops. So I think he didn't want to put more troops on the ground, but was hearing from some of the military leaders, we needed more troops on the ground. The work wasn't done. And I heard in that documentary that Obama tried to do a compromise between Biden, who wanted to get out, and his military leaders who said we need a surge. And so his idea, his compromise in the middle was let's do a surge with a time frame where we get out. And in retrospect, the military leaders said, well, that's ridiculous because you're telling your war plan to your enemy. So your enemy knows when you're leaving. So they just know if they buy their time, then they're cool. 18 months later, we're back in charge. So that compromise idea of Obama's strikes me as not a particularly good idea. And I think the drones were entangled in that decision.
I like how much you have all been, I think, very fair and have called together both. You have called out and given props to both parties, different presidents, different. And I think that that's really fair and a good assessment of sometimes foreign policy isn't so overtly partisan. It's always political, but it might not be always so easily Democrat versus Republican.
I was just going to say one thing about drones. America has a tendency to use high tech as opposed to, shall we say, other methods of power in its wars. And this is often a mixed blessing because, drones kill innocent people, and we're still using drone warfare around the Middle East, also in Africa, and it's not doing America's image much good at all. I will say sometimes it has worked. And actually Obama cut back the drone war a lot when he became aware of how undiscerning it was. But then Trump reversed it. But I do think that while we think drones are cool because they're a replacement for American soldiers, it kind of brings images of the Terminator. And people in these villages never know if someone's going to get blown up in their village, and they don't even hear or see the drones. It's like a bolt from Zeus. And so we may want to think about the fact that America has all these toys, but maybe that they shouldn't use them in many cases.
I think that's a really good point. Just because you have the new technology doesn't mean you should. But this goes back to the atomic bomb, right? America always is the cutting edge of the new big thing, and we want to use it, and then we use it, and everyone else has to make the policies about, well, maybe we should limit how much you have to use this. What's the only nation that's ever dropped an atomic bomb in war? The United States. Which one of us made stealth bombers a thing? The United States. Unmanned drone? The United States. And so sometimes being on the cutting edge has the difficult side of, okay, but now you have to choose to lead and use it effectively and ethically, and that's much harder. Okay, I've really, really enjoyed this. We've gone from all of the different perspectives, different presidents, what happened. I think everyone really did a good job tonight. If you have any questions, I will remind you that Dr. Van Aller's email is vanallerc@winthrop.edu. Dr. Disney's email is disneyj@winthrop.edu, and mine is benavidezb@winthrop.edu. If either of the last of you would like to finish with any concluding remarks, then we'll be done.
That's thank you, Dr. BRB, for organizing this event. And I want to thank so many of you for showing up and really engaging the conversation in passionate ways in the chat. And let's please continue the conversation. There are classes in comparative politics, international relations, and American foreign policy and American politics in the Department of Political Science. We have a Model United Nations program where you can get up and speak out from the perspective of the very countries that we're discussing. Dr. VA ran that program for 25 years and he trained me. I'll be taking over for him. I am this fall and in the spring. So please take our classes because it enables you to enact these policy prescriptions, learning about other countries and speaking on behalf of and seeing the world from diverse country perspectives, which is the only way we will begin to learn other countries and other cultures better, and therefore improve our own country's standing in the world as well.
I just want to say one thing also to everybody. A lot of this stuff is complicated, controversial, but all I would just emphasize is that I want people to stay engaged in the world.
Yes.
American culture is not very good about telling you to pay attention, but I know a lot of you, for example, have friends and loved ones in the US military who've actually even gone to these places. And I think it's both your moral and your citizen duty to pay attention. And I might say, in a kind of a personal note, when I was your age, I was in the old draft. I was just a bit too young for Vietnam. And so that was one reason I became a political scientist, because, but for the grace of God, there gone I. So, try to stay engaged, try to let your feelings be known to your elected leaders and so forth, because the future is yours in these incredibly vital issues.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you. Yes, I will reiterate that. Stay engaged. The United States is not the only country on the planet. We are really only 5% of the world's population. 95% of human beings live someplace else. So pay attention. We might have a lot of influence on the world, but we're not the only people on it. So it's always important to consider those other contexts, cultures, humanitarianism, and how it cuts multiple directions, foreign policy, pros and cons. I love this. I love this conversation. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'll ask the panelists for stay just a little bit longer so we can have a quick conversation. Everyone else, you are free to go.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see so many